Hi, everybody. Allan Walsh here with Adam Wylde on another episode of Agent Provocateur. How are you today, Adam?
I'm good, Allan. I'm anxiously awaiting our guest because this is going to be quite the episode.
It really is. And just as a bit of a preface to introducing our guest, anybody who's followed me on Twitter or has listened to me speak previously knows how passionate I am about the issue of hits to the head and for future neurological issues that come up, especially in retired players. And I've never really discussed where my passion for the issue comes from. So very briefly, I'll tell you that a number of years ago, I got a call from a player that I was always very close to, that I represented. He was retired, living in the United States. And he called me one day and I answered the phone, and he said, "Allan, I am," and he sounded very anxious and troubled. And he said, "Allan, I just pulled the car over. I went to the market to pick up some groceries for my wife, and I can't find my way home." And his house was about 2 miles from the supermarket, a trip that he had done hundreds of times previously. And on his way home, he got lost, could not figure out where he was, pulled the car over, and called me. And this player shared with me that he was forgetting things. He would lose his phone and search for it for hours. He'd lose his keys and not be able to find them. He would forget appointments. He would forget how to get to his kids' school to pick them up. And I started, I set up several appointments with him with different neurologists, and he had all the tests done. And I remember speaking to one of the doctors one day after, who said, "Allan, he's one of those players that is just has some issues with his brain right now." And I remember talking to this player after I spoke with the doctor, and I said, "Hey, you know what? I'm just trying to remember here. How many concussions did you have in your career?" And he said, "Including before I got to the NHL?" I said, "Yeah, in your whole life." And he said, "Well, 16, 17, if you want to add them all up." And I said, "And those are the ones you think you had, or those are just the documented ones?" He said, "Oh, no. Those are the documented ones. If we talk about the other times, probably in the 20s.
Oh my God.
And there's lots of players in the past and present who suffer head injuries, traumatic brain injuries. And even with all the awareness and education out there, hockey players, it's part of their DNA to want to get back out on the ice as fast as possible. And that was really part of his situation that really made me open my eyes and start voraciously reading everything written on the topic. And the more I read and the more I understood and the more I talked to players, the angrier I got that so many people involved in the game of hockey look the other way and don't seem to care about the issue or to do anything about it. And that's really the lead in to our guest this week. Welcome to another episode of Agent Provocateur. I'm Allan Walsh with Adam Wylde. Our special guest today is a lawyer. He won 6 Stanley Cups playing goal for the Montreal Canadiens, inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1983, the former president and general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the author of several best-selling books, including The Game, hailed as one of the greatest hockey books ever written. We're honored to welcome to the podcast, Ken Dryden.
Thanks, Allan. I'm glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing today?
Doing okay. I mean, it's the sun is shining here, and which it hasn't been doing a lot of for the last little while. So it does feel like spring is coming.
That's great. That's great. You recently wrote a very moving column in the Toronto Star, and the title of it was, "My Friend Bob Murdoch is struggling with Lewy body dementia. We must do more to stop headshots in sports." You ended your column with these words: "The NHL and the NHLPA talk about doing more. Doing more is good. Doing enough, that's the real point." So, Ken, in your opinion, is the NHL and the NHLPA doing enough to protect players' brains?
No, not at all. And I think that there has been an evolution in the last 10 or 15 years from basically either a lack of awareness, perhaps at first, then largely kind of distraction and purposeful distraction from it, and then working towards a point where there's pretty universal recognition. There is outside of the NHL and in other sports, and there is, I think, pretty much within the league as well, that this is a problem. But the question is, and it's something that it's really easy for anybody who's a decision maker, and I've been in positions of making decisions as well. It's really easy to say, well, we're doing more. I actually heard today on a sports broadcast, and it talked about Roger Goodell and what the NFL is doing in terms of diversity and hiring and so on. And his phrase was, like making progress. That's the easiest phrase in the world. And especially when you start with a really low bar. I mean, almost anything is doing more. Almost anything is making progress. The real question, always the real question for any decision maker in any field, is that given the nature of the problem, is the action that you are taking adequate and sufficient to address the problem? That is the doing enough. That's the point of it all. And sometimes you get into things where you can't do anymore. I mean, that you look around and you just sort of are completely any answer is just absent. We're all going to die. I mean, there's nothing we can do about that. But when you get into fields where, in fact, and moments and situations where you can do something, and if then you don't do something, that is really wrong. And that's the point of all of this. This is not a matter of throwing your arms up in the air and saying, I guess that's just in the nature of the game. I guess that's just the way we play. I guess, that this has always been and always will be. The game is the game and you can't change the game. That's not it at all. This game has changed forever, ever since the beginning. So that's the problem that I have in that regard. And with the article that you mentioned, what I wanted to write about. And I think the only way that any of us really come to get it isn't through the science of it, because almost none of us really are competent, sufficiently competent in science, certainly not confident of what we know about science. And we're pretty much at the mercy of what this scientist says as opposed to that one. And even though the overwhelming message of scientists and the universal message of those who are highly regarded make the connection between brain injuries and head hits, even in spite of all, is that the way we get it, I think, is when we personalize it.
Yes.
Is that what is it like actually when you have a brain injury? And Bob Murdoch, who you mentioned, and all of us who know Bob, we called him Mud. So he's Mud to everybody who ever played with him or played against him, and other friends he has. And Mud and I played together with the Canadian national team. We were roommates that year in Winnipeg. We played together with the Montreal Voyageurs in the American Hockey League. We played together with the Canadians. And then we played against each other when he was with the LA Kings. And Mud was a good player. I mean, he wasn't a great player, but he was a good player, a very solid, sound defenseman who was very smart. I mean, he just knew how to play, and that's the way he played at every level. And he was never going to make it because, he played college hockey at the University of Waterloo. Well, nobody ever came from Canadian colleges to play in the NHL, almost nobody from US colleges at that particular time. So he was never going to make it.
Right.
But he just worked at it and worked at it and worked at it and got better and worked his way up, with the national team and so on. And Bob was he was a defenseman, so there was always physical contact. But he wasn't a basher and he wasn't a goon. He got into a few fights in his career because virtually every player at that time did get into at least a couple of fights, because it was a time when, even though each team had a tough guy, the understanding was that you had an obligation to right your own wrongs. So if anybody did something to you, you would need to do something back, as opposed to the goon that you had on your team doing that. And so that was the nature of any of the fights that he was in. And again, he was a non-fighter. Almost always the people that he would be fighting with were non-fighters. It was kind of no big deal. So how would Bob, who played that way and played in the NHL for about 10 years before becoming an assistant coach in the league and a head coach, how would he end up where he is now at age 75, and after starting to show significant signs of some problems, some cognitive problems, starting around 10 years ago, and most particularly in the last 5 years? How would that happen? And it happens to people. At different times we have problems of dementia. It could happen to anybody at almost any age, but it does seem to happen more often to those who are involved in contact sports and those involved in hockey.
And in the NHL, former NHL players, there have been 14 former NHL players who've had their brains examined after death for CTE, and 13 of them have been found to have significant or severe CTE.
Yeah, and the thing that I think that's certainly part of the discussion.
Yeah,
but I think there's another part of the discussion as well, and that is in the absence of, first of all, as you described, you don't know, one doesn't know that you have CTE or not, and unless it's postmortem and there's been an examination of your brain. That's right. One. But the other part is that in the absence of CTE, that doesn't mean that you don't have significant cognitive problems, memory problems, anxiety, depression,
anger.
I mean, those things. And so it's not CTE or nothing.
Right.
CTE is certainly the smoking gun, but in advance of CTE, there are other smoking guns. And that becomes, the point in all this. And for all of the players, those who are playing currently, as well as those who have played in the past, I think pretty much everybody has seen teammates and friends where they're struggling a bit. They're forgetful. They forget their keys. Those things happen with age to everybody, but they do seem to be happening younger. And so why is this? Why is this? And that's why I wanted to write about Bob. I mean, Bob certainly played at another time, but Bob played in a way that is like this time. This isn't something where a current player or their families can say, well, yeah, it's something to worry about, but really, these guys are of another time, a different generation. We played differently then. We didn't know about these things then. Now we know about them. Now we're treating them better, this and that. Sorry, it's a nice, hopeful explanation. But the fact is that the way Bob played is the way that you would see on the ice surface now, and that current players would play. It's why in the same article I mentioned, Stan Mikita and Ralph Backstrom.
Yep.
They were older than Bob and I are. And they, again, in their 70s, developed Lewy body dementia. And after their death, were discovered to have had CTE.
Yes.
And again, easy to say, another time, another story doesn't pass the test. Those guys were players who were skaters. They were on the play. They were physical in the way of being on the play. They weren't bashers. They weren't fighters. They played the way this game is played now. Stan Mikita, when he was a kid, an immigrant from Czechoslovakia, he was a fighter. He felt that he had to fight in order to survive as a kid growing up in St. Catharines, and on the ice as well. Then he comes to the NHL, does the same for a couple of years, and realizes, I don't need to play that way, any longer. He's I think 4-time scoring champion. These were players that it would be convenient to be able to dismiss. But they are undismissible in this question. That's why I wanted to write about them and write about the human impact of it, because that's the problem with brain injuries, is that it's not nice to have a brain injury. We've all had shoulder injuries. We have knee injuries. We don't like to have them. We can't move our shoulder as well as we'd like to. We can't move our knee as well as we'd like to. Try a brain, in that way.
And that's the thing, Ken. When players of your era played, everyone knew I might have a bad shoulder later on in life, or I might need a knee replacement one day after hockey, based on the number of knee injuries or cartilage that have been removed in surgery. But no one knew, no one was informed, it was never talked about that all these players who had concussions and were jolted up against the boards and the collisions and the fighting and the body checks. And now we know it's not necessarily concussions, but repetitive subconcussive blows to the head impacts that might lead to neurodegenerative disease later on in hockey. They didn't know. You didn't know.
Yeah, that's true. But what that can do is also be a distraction from the point. It can, for somebody who is inclined not to focus on this, they can again say, well, that was then. They didn't know. We know now. And because we know now, we're doing things differently. Our doctors are doing things differently. Our coaches are doing things differently. The media is reporting differently. And therefore, now is a totally different world, and we don't need to pay attention to anything, before, because we're not going to, suffer the same consequences that those that came before. That is false reasoning, because what you need to do is, again, what is it that is the cause of these things? As best we know, as the best scientists know, it is blows to the head. Blows to the head can happen in 1875 at the Victoria Rink when the first game was played, or they can happen, right now. Those blows to the head can happen, and the key of it is finding ways of reducing those blows to the head. You're not going to remove them all. This doesn't become that kind of an argument. Of where, again, that somebody who doesn't want to pay attention can just sort of say, well, there's always going to be hits and there's always going to be this. Of course there is. There are always going to be players knocked out. Of course there are. There are always going to be concussions. Of course there are. The point is that you can reduce the number significantly and then even more. That is the point of it all. This is not a hopeless situation at all. Again, where you just sort of say, well, too bad, but I guess it's either or. We either play or we decide not to play. And that's life. Is that no, we can make our game better. We can make the game safer. I mean, look at the guys who are the great stars of this game, forever going back. I mean, that whether it's Rocket Richard and Gordie Howe and Bobby Orr and Guy Lafleur and Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky, and right up through the present, how many of those guys are headhunters? Virtually zero. Go down to the second level player, really outstanding players, Andy Bathgate, Frank Mahovlich, Bobby Hull, great player. How many of them are headhunters? Virtually zero. And contemporary players, Sidney Crosby, look at the way he plays. Tough, physical, in the corners, in front of the net, never backing off. That's the game that can be played, and that is played by virtually, every player in the league. And so somehow they manage to do it, and do it in a way where, where they are not a threat, really, in terms of head injuries to the next player they're playing against. It's absolutely possible. That's the part that's the inexcusable thing. We go back to doing something, doing more, making progress. Why that isn't the standard. That would be the standard if you really can't do anything more. There is all this that can be done more. And again, almost all of the players, Allan, that you represent now, and those that you will represent in the future, they've come up in minor hockey, where none of this is a factor. I mean, you go to the rinks, I go to the rink. I've got, we have two grandsons who are 14 and 11 who play minor hockey. They live in Connecticut. They play hockey in the Northeast. We're able to catch their games streamed. We watch them play. We go to their games when we're around. None of this stupid stuff. They play like crazy. They skate like crazy. They pass like crazy. They do stuff that is unimaginable. That's the nature of today's game. That's that's where the possibilities are. That's the future game, not the one that those, that many people in the NHL offices or in the PA offices are the former players who played the game, who are that wonderful voice because they played the game. The problem is they never played this game. They don't get this game. This is the game that they need to be making decisions on, not the game that is stuck in their head from 30 years ago.
So you proposed many times, and in a wonderful book that you wrote about Steve Monador called Game Change, that one of the major ways to focus and deal with this whole issue is a strict liability rule against hitting to the head. And I've talked with general managers, I've talked with people at the PA, and I've even talked with a few players about that idea. And many players agree, but it's the former players, just like you said, who are general managers or working in management in some capacity, working with the team. The common refrain I hear is, if you do that, you will take all hitting out of the game. How do you respond to that?
It's nuts. It bears no relationship to reality. And I mean, I think that I'm not sure that your phrasing is the right phrasing of strict liability. That's a lawyer's phrase. Let's move it into a hockey phrase.
Okay.
It's no hits to the head. That's what it is. A hit to the head is a penalty. That's what it is. And so for those people that you have spoken with that say that, whoa, that gets rid of, hitting in hockey and this strict liability stuff is that ask those same players who probably, when the rule was changed, where if you're in your own zone and if you shoot the puck over the glass is an automatic penalty, strict liability. Soon as you shoot it over the glass, penalty. Doesn't matter how it happened. Shorter glass in one rink than another, as it was at one point, early in the period or late in the period when the puck is flipping, whatever the explanations are, doesn't matter. If you shot it, it's not deflected, goes over the glass, penalty. The world came to an end for a month. Argument, this is nuts. The guys on TV, the commentators, this is a ridiculous rule. Sometimes it would put a team 2 men short, crazy stuff. What happened a month after that? Nothing. I mean, that it is virtually, there are 2 rules now that basically result in no arguments at all. One of them is this one, of where, it happens, the player is in the penalty box almost before the referee is over there to announce the penalty. I mean, he just goes there. He knows what's happened. He knows that it was dumb and there are all these explanations, but he also knows that it doesn't matter. He just goes to the box. The game goes on. Life goes on. The coach finds a new strategy. The players find new strategies. It's no big deal. The other one, same sort is the stick to the face.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Same thing. Again, when it first, was implemented, it was like, this is crazy. This is nuts. He didn't intend to, he struck somebody on the upper arm and it deflected up into the face. I mean, and the world was going to come to an end then as well. A month later, ever since. No arguments. You face, penalty, bleeding, double minor. That's it. No big deal. That you can do that. It's it didn't end the game as we know it, as this wouldn't end the game as we know it. Players are, I've said this very, very often, is that I think players are among the most competitive people on earth. And it's because they are the most adaptable people on earth. And actually the other way around, that they are the most adaptable people on earth because they're the most competitive people on earth. That just give them a situation and they find a way. That's their job. That's what they've been doing since they were 5 years old and they started playing, is that every game goes in 100 different directions that they never imagined and that coach had never planned for, and they've got to have answers for. And so they do. Same thing, in all of this. It's so utterly answerable on the one hand, and on the other, the result is so unforgiving and so lousy. That again, it is one thing to have a knee that limps. It is a totally, totally other thing when you have a brain that limps. That is a bad deal. You don't want that to happen. And this doesn't need to happen in nearly the same dimensions as it happens now. And it will happen in the future unless enough is done to deal with it.
So, Ken, why? Why are we here? Why have the powers that be who run the game not seen fit to make these changes? Why?
That's a really good question. And I think that I started with the assumption that one, that science was sort of insufficient to be very clear. We're well beyond that now. Park that.
Yes.
I thought that there was a lack of awareness of the real consequences in terms of players and players' lives. I think that I think the answer to that one is that, yeah, that's probably right, but that is a willful ignorance. It is there. Any owner of a team, all they need to do if they're interested is have a conversation with some of the players who played 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier. Having had those conversations with those players 5 years from the end of their careers, and notice the differences that are there. It is total willful ignorance. So you can legitimately park that. The thing that is stunning to me, and then what I thought is that, well, it's the absence of answers. And so that's why when I wrote Game Change, the longest chapter in the book is the here's how, and utterly consistent with the history of the game, with the understandings of the game, some of the stuff that we've been talking about today, the fact that the head has always been understood as a vulnerable area. That's why 100 years ago or whenever it was, that a high sticking penalty was implemented. You don't high stick somebody's shoulder. It's all about high sticking somebody's head. An elbow. You don't elbow somebody's shoulder. It's elbowing somebody's head. So you have specific penalties for hits to the head. So, I thought that maybe that somehow there wasn't confidence of an answer. And again, if there isn't, it's willful ignorance of it and a willful misdirection and look the other way. The thing that and so the league has been virtually silent. I think that there have been some increase in penalties and suspensions than before. I think that is part of things. I think the commentators have changed, and in the sense where almost always now, if there's a hit, the commentator will ask the question, was that a head hit? Was it a head hit or was it on the shoulder and so there's a much greater sensitivity among the commentators now in terms of making a hit to the head its own special category. And that is, that's better than before. One of the NHL as a league, they seem to be, to take things as, this is to make it all legalistic and say, prove it, prove it, go to a court, prove it. And as soon as science knows, we'll follow the science, which is a complete, again, completely disingenuous, because the nature of science is that you never know. Science is always about knowing the best you can know at any particular time. And then it's the job of the decision maker to know the best that can be known at a time and then applying it. And so, it's just a decision not to. One of the parties that is, to me, mystifyingly silent in it is the Players Association. I mean, it's like, when have you heard Don Fehr say anything about this? I mean, really, like, when was the last time and of any kind of significance? When does that seem to come up as a question to be dealt with in terms of the league? And when, why, and then mostly, why this silence?
And one would think this would be one of the predominant workplace safety issues of our time.
Absolutely. I mean, that again, when there is this kind of a silence, then you sort of think like, well, there's got to be a reason for this. I mean, that this is not for nothing that it's this way. So if you say to yourself, as you just said, Allan, of where this is about a workplace, this is about the safety of a workplace. Players' unions, a union of any sort, has to do with the workplace. It has to do with the economics of a workplace and the economic rewards of a workplace. It also has to do with the safety of a workplace.
Yes.
So if that's what essentially by definition a players' union, a players' association is, this and if in fact, so that can be the first part of it. Then the second part of it is that, okay, if you're the Players Association and if you're the head of the Players Association, it is your job to maximize the benefits towards your membership. That's your job. Any union, anywhere, in any field, that's your job, maximizing the benefits.
And what drives us, Ken, and what drives me is the idea that the money and the lifestyle and the quality of life and the cognitive abilities that players have when they retire, they get to enjoy that not for 5 years, but for 50 years.
Allan, this is the point, and this is what we've talked about before, and this is the crunch of it and the crux of it. And this is the question that I would want Don Fehr to answer. And that is that if it is your job, your background, Don, is from baseball. Your mentor, your hero was Marvin Miller. Marvin Miller was central to the Steelworkers Union. Steelworkers are people that where safety matters. That's part of the negotiations. So Don, you're part of that. You're there with Marvin Miller in baseball. The issues are more economic than they are safety. That's fine. That's the way it is. You're maximizing the benefits. Wherever the benefits happen to be, wherever the problems, happen to be, you have to address them. Mostly in baseball, they were economic.
Yep.
Some safety, but mostly economic. Then you move over to hockey. In hockey, it's both. It's economic and it is safety. Now, it's your job. It's the Players Association's job to maximize the benefits to your membership. That means in terms of the economic returns, that means in terms of the safety. And what I would want to hear him answer is that, Don, don't you think that it is your job to see that the players get as much money as possible while they're playing, and then have as much time as possible, safe, cognitively healthy, and to enjoy that money for the next 50 years of their lives after they stop playing? Is that not the job of it? It is to maximize the financial return and to maximize the enjoyment of that return over all of those years. I don't know. I gave a talk one time where Don was in the audience, and I made sure I made that point. And I've never heard an answer. Why isn't it both? And as we've talked about earlier, it can be both. It's not about giving up the economic opportunity in order to enjoy that economic opportunity longer. You can, address your own workplace and make it a much safer place, just as unions everywhere, associations everywhere have done, as the steelworkers did, as the coal miners in Pennsylvania and in West Virginia. That's what you do. So why not? I mean, tell me why. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, so let's say right now you're addressing the current players of today. That's part of your audience right now. What do you say to them?
I say to them, you can have it both ways. You totally can have it both ways. That's the part that one, your game can change as your game has always changed. Even those who are the veteran players, now, or even players have only played 5 or so years, they will have seen the changes that have happened, let alone the changes that have happened over 20 years, 40 years, 50 years. The changes happen. They have always adapted to those changes. They can make the changes work for them. That you don't need to worry about that. You kind of treat this situation as if it's another opponent. And with opponents, you're always finding new answers. You find an answer, to all of this. That's the first part of it. And then this, and the second part is that you can have that enjoyment 30, 40, 50 years afterwards. I mean, what could be, well, there are a lot of things that could be worse, but a really bad thing is to be, 40 years old, 45 years old, 50 years old, and have all of this money that you could do all kinds of things with. You can start businesses, you can travel, you can support, charitable groups, you can whatever. You can do any of those things. And the awful thing is that you have all of that possibility and you don't quite have the capability anymore of doing it. That is haunting. That is a horrible, horrible thing to think about. And so I would say that first of all to the players is that you can have it both ways. I would also speak to the players, wives, partners, families. That they worry about their player, their son, their husband, their partner. They worry about them. They worry about stuff like this.
Sure.
And they really, really don't want their husband, son, brother to be have less capacity to do things as life goes on. And it's really interesting. I mean, I've read about a number of NFL players and their wives. They're a pretty active, agitating group. It's you're signing up for better or for worse, but you don't want this kind of worse, in it. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I mean, one of the things, in all of this, I mean, maybe the most effective citizen advocacy group that I can think of, and I'm sure that there are others, but they don't come to mind, is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Mm-hmm. MAD. And why are they so effective? Because they have this total rightness on their side. I mean, and the wrongness that has happened and the rightness of their position. And that utter wrongness of, here is their son or daughter who's been in a car accident with somebody else driving who was drunk. And their kid is dead because of it. And how wrong is that? And I mean, it was impossible 30 years ago to imagine that drunk driving would be like a real big thing. I mean, 30 years or so ago, it was like, let's go out and get smashed. And I was totally smashed, and I still drove 400 miles, and it was no big deal. I mean, it was a big achievement, and it was a big laugh. Not a big achievement, not a big laugh, any longer. They changed the mood, on all of that. They changed the way of thinking on all of that. And I've often thought, is that imagine what mothers could do in terms of head hits. It could be Mothers Against Head Hits, MAHH, or spouses against head hits, or families against head hits. That set them loose, that's what they're feeling. So, that allow for it to happen. And so I guess what I would just say to the players is that we all think that we are different from every generation that came before us, all of us in any field. And for the most part, we're not. And it's hard to understand now. It's hard to appreciate that now. And maybe it's almost impossible to appreciate if you're 22 years old or 25 years old. You haven't had that experience yet.
Right.
That is why, organizations or fields have things like players associations. That's why you have somebody like Adon Fear, who's lived 7 decades, who's experienced all of these things, who's seen these kinds of ups and downs, others who work at the Players Association, all of those who work in the league, the same thing, that the players are really in your hands. That's, that in your 40-year-old hands, your 50-year-old hands, your 60-year-old hands. You're supposed to offer this other perspective that somebody who's 25 is not always going to have. And it's not their fault that they don't have it. They're 25. When we were 25, we were all like that. We all needed another voice that said something that was kind of like the cautionary voice in it, that if we weren't going to push it, they would. Where is that voice? Where's that alternative voice? These players, are in in your hands as the Players Association, as the league. Act, do something. It's possible. And that's what I find totally mystifying. I mean, it's just bizarre. And if I was a player, I would go to the next Players Association meeting and I would say, Don, you're doing a great job. I mean, that the amount, that the money that I'm making and this and that, I mean, it's terrific. I mean, boy, oh boy, am I ever lucky. And I know I'm lucky. And generations of players before me weren't nearly as lucky. And I just pinch myself. And thanks for all you've done. But Don, don't you think it's also something that we should talk about, of how, as lucky as I am, I really want to be lucky for the rest of my life.
Yes.
I want to be lucky for 50 more years. And Don, don't you think we can do more on this? Don't you think that that's possible? That's what I would like to say to the players and to their families, to their wives, their partners, their friends, is you can have it both and use those instruments. If the players are reluctant, it's sort of understandable. The agents, they're another part. They're this older voice as well.
Yep.
Where is that older voice? In it. But if the agents are can be party to the push, that's also fine. So if you got the players who are reluctant, the agents whose job it is to push, but they're not as central in it as the players are. And if you've got the wives and partners and families that don't feel it's their place, what is it all that they are all in the hands of the Players Association. That literally the Players Association is the instrument of the players, and by extension, the instrument of those that are closely connected to the players, their families and their agents. They're the instrument, they're the body to push, this. And instead, silence. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's bizarre. And I understand that there's a meeting coming up in April with the agents and the Players Association. And you know all about it. And I only know a little bit about it. And of where it's the conversation between the Players Association and the agents. And I don't understand why an agent wouldn't sound like the player that I'm talking about, saying, Don, you're doing a great job, all of this, but don't you think, and why not? And this whole thing, Don, remember, Don, the central point, the crux of all of this, your job to maximize the benefits for the players now and for the maximum enjoyment of the players later. That it's two things. There's not a period over maximizing the benefit of the players now, period. No period, comma, then and to maximize the benefit that the players will feel over their lifetimes.
Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point? You make all this money, you have a wonderful, beautiful family, and you're 40 years old, you're retired, and you have neurological issues. Your brain isn't working properly. What's the point of everything you've just done?
That's the question that needs to be asked and to insist that the answer comes. I mean, we're all pretty good at dancing and of, kind of offering an answer and kind of not. And I remember, I don't even remember saying this, but apparently I did. It was when I was with the Leafs, and there was a guy who worked there at the time, and he's still there. And he remembers me saying it, and that it was kind of an ongoing joke between us. And it would be after he would tell me about a variety of things, and I would say, that I would say, don't tell me how rough the waters are. Just bring the ship home. That's, to Don, to Gary, no, sorry, not interested in you telling me how rough the waters are. Bring the ship home. It's able to be brought home. And there's an obligation to bring it home.
Adam, do you have anything to add right now?
I wanted to ask you, Ken, because, and my age group, I'm 33 years old. I didn't know hockey. I didn't know a Saturday night without Don Cherry for 31 of those years. And the type of coverage that espoused, and obviously Don was a huge name. You didn't miss Don Cherry on a Saturday night. He talked about the rough and tumble Canadian, what Canadian hockey was supposed to be like. How you stood up for your teammates, and oftentimes, and Ken, you get into this in the book about the fighting and the culture and how hockey shifted in the 80s, where fighting basically doubled overnight. And it's incredible to see the culture shift that's occurred in the last, I would say, 5 years, because Don Cherry went from being the voice to very quickly, with people my age, we started to look at the research and say, okay, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't square anymore. The fan support is there, especially among younger fans. It's not hard for us to envision a world with less fights because we've seen it. We've watched it decrease and decrease and decrease. And I think the most frustrating thing is, a la climate change, it seems to be the only people holding back are the people that hold the keys. So what can fans do to help move the needle here? Because as a fan, I'm listening and going, all of this makes complete sense to me. And I can see a game where there's hitting, where it's not completely safe, but you're minimizing and you're doing everything you can to minimize it. Just like traffic accidents. There will always be traffic accidents, but how do you minimize them? So what does a fan do, Mr. Dryden and Mr. Walsh, to move this forward on our end?
That's a really good question. And it's interesting, your description of it's interesting. If I was just a fan in this, one of the things that has surprised me about, and this would be something that I would have some influence on, I think, is CBC's coverage. Is that Don Cherry has been replaced, but the essential tone of the commentary hasn't changed a lot. I mean, Don Cherry is much more entertaining and more interesting in a way, and has a very interesting mind. But the kind of commentary and the tough guy voice is there and kind of carries the day. I mean, is the one that, that anybody that might have another opinion, it's, you have to kind of fight for your space, and you're not going to be taken that seriously because this other guy's a real hockey guy and anybody else is just kind of pretend. And so it's like, CBC, are you watching hockey? Are you watching this? The people who are your commentators, they don't play anymore. They haven't played for some time. Some only for they're only for the last couple of years. Others longer than that. Are they really watching the nature of what is going on the ice and who the stars are and the secondary stars and the tertiary stars and how they're playing? Are they watching kids play? Are they watching the nature of the game as it is? And if they aren't, they need to. And if they do, they're going to be much less patient with those voices on Hockey Night in Canada that are kind of the wise, tough old player roles, in it. time is gone. I mean, really, I mean, you know, I mean, I'm trying, like, I don't watch the intermissions as much now as I used to. It seems to me that is it Kevin
Bieksa?
Yeah. I mean, he's sort of the resident hockey tough guy, you know, voice. And listen to people like Ray Ferraro and others, you know, really interesting, really smart, you know, thinking, watching what is there to be seen, thinking about what he sees, responding to what he sees, not to what is supposed to be seen or what he's always seen before. Be impatient with those that are not talking to a reality. And so that's or insist, you know, Hockey Canada is offer at least an alternative voice, offer other voices, not just
pushes back.
Kind of a dominant voice. Yeah. And that the others could be alternative voices, but they aren't, and they don't play that role, is that allow for another voice. And the other, you know, the other broadcasting or the other networks, pretty much the same thing. Allow for the other voice, challenge that voice. Don't just accept that voice, and always say to that voice, how many players that you played with, how are they doing? Know anybody who isn't doing so well? And
tell those stories. Tell those stories.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like and I think that, and so I'm trying to think of how, you know, that what the fan can do most of you know, the best of anybody is offer a personal perspective. That's what, I mean, I've done concussion seminars and things like that. And what we always started with, before we brought in the scientists and the rest of it, is bring in the local athlete. Let them tell their story. You know, the 14-year-old girl soccer player, the 17-year-old lacrosse player, that let them tell their story, and let them tell the story of well, what was it like? How did it feel? How did it feel 4 days later? How did it feel in terms of what you needed to do in terms of school? What did that make you feel about yourself? You know, how did you deal with your friends? What does life feel like, you know, under these kinds of circumstances? Allow for a personal voice, not sort of a professional, disconnected, objective voice. Offer the you know, somebody who's a friend of somebody like Mud. Just, you know, what is it like to see? What is it like? Lousy, really, really lousy. Well, you know, that's and to put the pressure on those commentators. I mean, what would really, really be interesting at some point is for a commentator to say, and a few almost have, of when there's something really outrageous that happens, is not only, you know, that they'll go as far as, well, there's no place for that, you know, in this
game.
That, you know, they'll kind of go that for that. That would be the extent of their outrage, is really to go farther than that and say, really, what was he doing there? What right did he have to, you know, to put at risk that player and put at risk that player's next year's future contract, you know, future career, future life? What right? You know, I don't care that guy's a great guy. We're always hearing that as the explanation. Well, he's a great guy. That's not like him. You know, I'm glad he's a great guy, but great guys can do lousy things. So allow yourself to say that this guy's a great guy, but he did a lousy thing. And he had no right to do that. He had no right to put in jeopardy that person, that player, and what that player's and that person's future may be. No right whatsoever. Now, you know, that would be really good to hear, on a broadcast. And I don't hear that. So I think, as a fan, just keep pushing on that. No, not interested in just the professional commentary. I want to hear, the rest. One of the things that I thought of at one point is that the NHL, and I've seen at least some of them, the player safety when somebody is suspended,
The videos
and the explanations that are there, and they're really interesting. They're well put together. That you see the play from 10 different action or from angles, and they don't, I haven't noticed anyway, maybe they do, but I haven't noticed them sort of pulling back from that and not showing a particularly awful angle. They'll show it, and then they'll offer the explanation of how that fits into the rules or doesn't fit into the rules. And so what I really love to hear is essentially sort of a player impact statement, is that, this is what has occurred. And so in the end, player X will be suspended for 2 games. I want to hear about player Y. The player Y is still in the hospital, or player Y has felt this and felt that, and player Y has had a few concussions before. Not only is it in terms of the perpetrator, where there's discussion of whether that person is a repeat offender, is that get into the other person. Is this other player a repeat victim, and where this is his second known concussion or his fourth, and that is taken into consideration, as well as the repeat offender, part of it. Because those are the consequences back and forth.
Right.
Not just somebody that gets suspended for 2 games; it's somebody else who has to live with the action that resulted in the suspension.
And when players are concussed or suffering the after effects of a traumatic brain injury, you very rarely, if ever, hear from them. And it's sort of the great unsaid. The media doesn't talk about it. The players don't talk about it. It's almost taboo.
No, that's a good point, and that's right. And it's as if, I don't know what I guess what it is in part. It's that maybe you're jinxing yourself if you're talking about it, or that that your teammates, that they don't need to be distracted. We've all got a task here. We've all got a game to win, and they don't need to know about me dealing with this. Everybody has to deal with something. Fred last week, I know he was struggling with his knee, and I know somebody else with, and we're all struggling, and nobody needs to know. And I think, for whatever reason, and I think that's part of it, is that players, they, and I don't think any of us want other people to know that we're struggling. It's not, that I think that what we want, all of us, and it goes back to, some of the players that I've been talking about. Almost all of them don't talk about it, when they're going through it. And I think that the fear is that then everybody else will start looking on them in a different way.
Yes.
They're no longer Fred. They're Fred after Fred was Fred. And I don't want people to treat me other than as Fred. We got along great, when I was Fred, and I love being Fred with them. And I'm really afraid that this will change everything. And so if I don't talk about it and I don't make it a deal in any way, then even if I'm struggling with it on the one side, at least I'll have a kind of normalcy on the other side.
Right.
And I think that's probably what happens.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, Ken, this has been a really heartfelt discussion. That it's a topic that has always meant a lot to me, and I've been speaking out on this issue for many years. I am so honored that you graced us with your presence today, and you were so generous with your time. And I make a pledge to you that I'm going to do everything I can to make sure as many NHL players as possible hear this podcast, hear your words, and hope that what you've said today and what you've said many times in the past, and what you wrote about your friend Bob Murdoch and some of the other players like Stan Mikita and Rick Martin and Steve Monador and others, that people will know their stories and use this as a call to action, so that we don't have to come back here in 5 years and ask each other why. Where does the silence come from? And I think that's the greatest contribution that we could make today. And I'm so honored to be able to participate in that with you.
Well, thanks, Allan, and I've really and Adam. It's really I'm glad to have had the chance to talk to some players in a way that it's often difficult to that. I mean, most players will not have read the articles that I've written or read the book that I did. Most won't hear the interviews that are done, nor will their spouses or partners or families.
Yeah.
So it can be an opportunity to speak, and again, just treat it as personally as it really is. I mean, it is a really deeply personal, question and a reality of life for you, and to understand it that way, and don't sit back. I mean, sitting back doesn't work. I mean, at a certain point, what starts to get work and what starts to work is again, like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's get mad. I mean, there's every reason to get mad. This is your life. This is and your family's life. It's not anybody else's. It's yours. And for Gary Bettman and for Don Fear, it's time to bring the ship home.